Dr. Richard Collins, a well-respected psychiatrist, had always found solace in his work. His office, a haven of tranquility with its soft lighting, overstuffed chairs, and serene artwork, had seen countless patients find their way back to sanity. But none had ever unsettled him, quite like the new patient who arrived one dreary Monday morning. The patient, whose paperwork identified him only as John Doe, was brought in by two burly orderlies. He was a gaunt man, seemingly in his late 30s, with hollow eyes that seemed to look through everything and everyone. His hair was unkempt, and his clothes hung loosely on his thin frame. Most strikingly, he was silent, his lips pressed into a thin, unwavering line. "Good morning," Dr. Collins greeted, his voice calm and welcoming, as always. "My name is Dr. Collins. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The man offered no response. His eyes flickered momentarily to meet Dr. Collins' gaze before returning to the floor. Dr. Collins noted the tension in the man's posture, the dark circles under his eyes, and the way his hands fidgeted restlessly. "It's all right if you're not ready to talk yet," Dr. Collins continued, jotting down observations in his notebook. "We can take things at your pace." The first session passed in complete silence. The man, John Doe, sat motionless, occasionally glancing around the room, but never uttering a word. Dr. Collins tried various approaches, gentle questions and prompts, but nothing seemed to reach the patient. When the hour was up, the orderlies escorted the man back to his room in the psychiatric ward. Over the next few sessions, the pattern remained unchanged. John Doe's silence was impenetrable, a thick fog that Dr. Collins couldn't navigate. But then, something shifted. One day, as Dr. Collins was wrapping up their session, the patient left a piece of paper on the small table between them before being led away. Dr. Collins picked up the paper, intrigued. It was a drawing, crude but detailed, depicting a shadowy figure standing in a nondescript room. The figure's face was obscured, but its eyes were drawn with meticulous care, two dark voids that seemed to bore into Dr. Collins's soul. "Interesting," Dr. Collins murmured, studying the drawing. He wondered if this was John Doe's way of communicating, a nonverbal expression of his inner world. He decided to encourage this form of expression, hoping it might eventually lead to a breakthrough. In the following sessions, John Doe continued to leave drawings and notes. The drawings grew more detailed, often depicting scenes of violence and terror. The notes were fragmented, containing cryptic phrases like "he watches" and "never safe." Dr. Collins meticulously analyzed each piece, trying to piece together the patient's story. One day, a particularly disturbing drawing appeared. It depicted a street that looked remarkably like Dr. Collins' own neighborhood. The houses, the trees, even the streetlights were unmistakable. In the background, a shadowy figure lurked, watching a house that bore an unsettling resemblance to Dr. Collins' home. Dr. Collins' heart skipped a beat. He dismissed it as a coincidence, but a seed of unease had been planted. As more drawings followed, each one eerily accurate in its depiction of places and scenes from Dr. Collins's life, that seed grew into a gnawing anxiety. He decided to delve deeper into John Doe's past, hoping to find some explanation for the man's apparent knowledge of his life. He requested the patient's records from the referring institution, but was met with a frustrating lack of information. John Doe was a complete enigma, his history as blank as the silent walls of Dr. Collins' office. The notes and drawings continued, each one more unsettling than the last. One note in particular sent chills down Dr. Collins' spine. He knows everything. That night, as Dr. Collins lay in bed, the shadows in his room seemed to dance with a life of their own. The feeling of being watched, once a vague unease, now felt like a constant, oppressive presence. Determined to understand, Dr. Collins began spending long hours in his study, poring over the drawings and notes, cross-referencing them with his own life. The realization that the patient had been watching him for years was a slow, creeping horror that seeped into every aspect of his being. The silent enigma of John Doe had become an obsession for Dr. Collins, one that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed life he had built. He knew he had to get to the bottom of this mystery, but the deeper he delved, the more it seemed like he was looking into an abyss, one that stared back with unblinking, hollow eyes. The atmosphere in Dr. Collins' office had shifted from one of professional detachment to a palpable tension. The air felt heavier, charged with an invisible weight that pressed down on him with each passing session. The unsettling familiarity of John Doe's drawings gnawed at the edges of his sanity, and the cryptic notes seemed to burrow into his thoughts, echoing in the silence of his home long after he left the office. Dr. Collins found himself dreading the appointments, but he couldn't resist the compulsion to unravel the mystery of John Doe. On one particularly gloomy afternoon, he arrived early and locked himself in his study, determined to decipher the newest batch of notes and drawings. As he examined them under the harsh light of his desk lamp, he noticed a pattern, a series of numbers and symbols interwoven into the background of the sketches. They seemed familiar, but he couldn't place their significance. After hours of poring over the materials, his eyes gritty with fatigue, he made a breakthrough. The numbers were dates, and the symbols, when deciphered, represented locations. He mapped them out and discovered a disturbing pattern. Each date and location corresponded to significant moments in his life. The day he graduated, the day he moved into his house, even the day his mother passed away. It was as if John Doe had been a silent observer, chronicling his life from the shadows. Dr. Collins's hands trembled as he traced the lines on the map he had drawn. The final date and location were the most chilling. It was tomorrow, and it pointed to his office. His breath quickened as he struggled to comprehend the implications. How could this patient know so much about him? The answer seemed just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue. Desperate for answers, he decided to confront John Doe directly, despite the man's stubborn silence. The next day, Dr. Collins arrived at his office earlier than usual. The building was eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive stillness. He settled into his chair and waited, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. When the orderlies finally brought John Doe in, Dr. Collins felt a jolt of fear. The patient's gaunt frame seemed even more spectral in the dim light, his hollow eyes fixing on Dr. Collins with an intensity that made him shiver. The silence between them was thick, almost tangible, as the orderlies left and the door clicked shut. "John," Dr. Collins began, his voice steady but edged with tension. "I need you to tell me how you know these things about me." John Doe remained silent, his gaze unwavering. Dr. Collins pressed on, laying out the drawings and notes before him. "These dates, these places, they're all from my life. How do you know them?" For a moment it seemed as though the patient might speak. His lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table to Dr. Collins. With a sense of foreboding, Dr. Collins unfolded the paper. It was a drawing of his office, but not as it was now. The room was in disarray, papers scattered, furniture overturned. In the center of the chaos stood a figure, its face obscured, but the eyes unmistakable, dark voids staring directly at him. The sight of the drawing sent a chill down Dr. Collins' spine. "What is this?" he demanded, his composure slipping. "Is this a threat?" John Doe's response was a slight tilt of his head, his expression inscrutable. The silence that followed was deafening, and Dr. Collins felt a rising sense of panic. He needed to understand, to make sense of the madness that had engulfed his life. Driven by desperation, he decided to change tactics. He pulled out a recorder, set it on the table, and pressed record. "Tell me, John," he said, his voice low and urgent, "what do you want from me?" Again there was no verbal response, but John Doe leaned forward, his eyes boring into Dr. Collins. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and pointed to the corner of the room where a mirror hung on the wall. Dr. Collins followed his gaze, confusion and fear mingling in his mind. The mirror, a seemingly innocuous object, now felt like a portal to something dark and unknown. He turned back to John Doe, but the patient had already shifted his focus, his hand now pointing to another drawing on the table. This one was different. It depicted a room, Dr. Collins' bedroom. In the corner of the room, near the bed, was a shadowy figure. The details were chillingly accurate, down to the smallest piece of furniture. The implication was clear and terrifying. John Doe knew not just about Dr. Collins' public life, but his most private moments. The psychiatrist's mind raced with questions, each one more disturbing than the last. How long had this patient been watching him? What did he want? In a final, desperate attempt to break through the silence, Dr. Collins leaned forward, his eyes locked on John Doe's. "Please," he whispered, "tell me how you know these things. Tell me what you want." For a moment it seemed as though John Doe might respond. His eyes flickered with something, a hint of emotion perhaps. But then he leaned back, the expression fading into the familiar, inscrutable mask. The session ended with more questions than answers, the silence between them more oppressive than ever. As the orderlies led John Doe away, Dr. Collins felt a profound sense of dread. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was one of horror and madness. That night, as Dr. Collins reviewed the session's recording, he noticed something he hadn't before. In the background of the audio, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of breathing. Not his, not John Doe's, but something else, something that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. The days following the latest session with John Doe were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights for Dr. Collins. His mind churned ceaselessly, trying to piece together the fragments of information, the cryptic drawings, and the eerie notes. The sense of being watched grew stronger, an almost tangible presence that haunted his every step. Dr. Collins began to withdraw from his colleagues and friends, his once immaculate appearance now marred by dark circles under his eyes and a disheveled demeanor. His home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a shadow, set his nerves on edge. One evening, as he sat in his study, surrounded by the disturbing evidence of John Doe's obsession, he noticed something strange. Among the papers and drawings was a new note that hadn't been there before. His heart raced as he picked it up, hands trembling. The note contained a single sentence. "Look behind you." A chill ran down his spine. He turned slowly, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. But there was nothing. The room was empty, the silence deafening. He turned back to the note, studying it for any clue, any hidden meaning. His paranoia deepened, and he began to question his own sanity. Determined to find answers, Dr. Collins decided to revisit the recordings of his sessions with John Doe. He hoped to find something he had missed, some detail that could explain the patient's uncanny knowledge of his life. As he listened, he became increasingly aware of the faint breathing in the background, a sound that seemed to grow louder with each session. The recordings revealed something else as well. In several of them there were moments of silence, followed by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. Dr. Collins amplified the audio, straining to make out the words. The whispers were fragmented, but he could discern a few phrases. "He knows, always watching, and can't escape." The implications were terrifying. It wasn't just that John Doe knew about his life. It was as if he was inside his mind, aware of his every thought and fear. Dr. Collins' grip on reality began to slip, the line between his professional detachment and personal paranoia blurring dangerously. In a desperate bid for clarity, he decided to confront the source of his torment directly. He requested another session with John Doe, this time under the pretext of needing more information for his treatment. The patient was brought in, as silent and inscrutable as ever. Dr. Collins wasted no time. "John," he began, his voice shaking with barely suppressed fear, "I need you to explain these drawings. How do you know so much about me? What is it that you want?" John Doe's reaction was unexpected. For the first time, his expression changed. His eyes, usually dull and lifeless, sparkled with a strange intensity. He leaned forward, his lips parting slightly, and whispered, "You already know." The word sent a shiver down Dr. Collins' spine. "Know what?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Tell me." John Doe simply smiled, a chilling, almost triumphant smile, and slid another piece of paper across the table. Dr. Collins snatched it up, his hands trembling. The drawing depicted a room filled with photographs of Dr. Collins at various stages of his life, from childhood to the present. In the center of the room was a single photograph, larger than the others. It was a picture of Dr. Collins himself, standing in his office, staring at the very drawing he now held. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The patient had been in his office, had access to his life in ways he couldn't comprehend. The sense of being watched, the creeping paranoia, it was all real. But how? How could John Doe be everywhere, see everything? Dr. Collins felt the walls closing in on him. His mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was John Doe a stalker, a master manipulator who had somehow infiltrated his life? Or was there something more sinister at play, something beyond his understanding? The session ended with no more answers than it had begun. John Doe was led away, his silence now a mocking echo in Dr. Collins' mind. The psychiatrist was left alone, surrounded by the evidence of his unraveling sanity. That night, sleep eluded him once again. He sat in his study, staring at the drawings and notes, the pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, an oppressive weight that bore down on him with each passing hour. In a moment of desperation, he decided to check the mirror in his office. The patient's silent gesture towards it had haunted him, and he needed to know if there was something he had missed. He grabbed a flashlight and headed to his office, the empty hallways of the building echoing with his footsteps. The mirror hung innocuously on the wall, reflecting the dim light of the room. Dr. Collins approached it cautiously, shining the flashlight on its surface. At first, he saw nothing unusual, but as he looked closer, he noticed faint marks around the edges, as if the mirror had been moved or tampered with. His heart pounded as he ran his fingers along the frame, feeling for any hidden mechanisms. His fingers brushed against a small latch, almost invisible against the ornate design. He hesitated, a sense of foreboding washing over him, but his curiosity and desperation pushed him forward. He flicked the latch, and the mirror swung open like a door, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Inside the compartment were photographs, dozens of them, pinned to the wall like a macabre collage. Each photograph was of Dr. Collins, captured in various moments of his life. Some were recent, taken within the past few weeks, while others were older, from his college days and early career. The realization that someone had been documenting his life for years was a horrifying revelation. Among the photographs was a diary, its cover worn and faded. Dr. Collins opened it with trembling hands, skimming through the entries. The handwriting was erratic, filled with obsessive details about his life, his habits, and his fears. The last entry, dated just a few days ago, read, "He knows I'm watching. He must be stopped." Dr. Collins' mind raced as he tried to comprehend the implications. Who had written this? Was it John Doe or someone else? The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one of madness and obsession. As he stood there, staring at the evidence of his own surveillance, he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. The empty room seemed to mock him, the shadows dancing in the corners like specters. The descent into madness had begun, and Dr. Collins knew that he was in a battle for his very sanity. The silent enigma of John Doe had consumed his life, and he was determined to find the truth, no matter the cost. Dr. Collins couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Each passing day felt like a descent deeper into madness. The photographs, the diary, and the cryptic notes were a constant reminder of the unseen threat that loomed over him. His professional demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a frantic obsession to uncover the truth. The next session with John Doe felt like an interrogation. Dr. Collins was determined to extract answers, to break through the silence that had haunted him for so long. As John Doe was brought into the room, Dr. Collins could see the faint smirk on his face, as if he knew something Collins didn't. The psychiatrist's hands trembled as he arranged his notes, trying to maintain a facade of control. "John," he began, his voice betraying his anxiety, "I need you to tell me about these drawings, these notes. How do you know so much about me? What is your end game?" John Doe remained silent, his gaze steady and unnervingly calm. The room felt stifling, the air thick with tension. Dr. Collins pressed on, showing the diary and the photographs. "These," he said, pointing to the images. "How did you get them? Who took these photos?" For a moment it seemed like John Doe might finally speak. His lips parted slightly, and his eyes flickered with a hint of emotion. But instead of answering, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table to Dr. Collins, who snatched it up with desperate hands. The note was simple, yet chilling. "Check your attic." Dr. Collins felt a cold dread settle over him. His attic. What could possibly be up there? He finished the session with John Doe, feeling more lost than ever. The patient was led away, his silence now a deafening roar in Dr. Collins' mind. That evening, Dr. Collins stood at the base of the attic stairs, flashlight in hand. He had lived in this house for years, but rarely ventured into the attic. It was a place of forgotten memories and dusty relics, not the kind of place where one would expect to find answers. He hesitated, the note clenched in his fist, before finally mustering the courage to climb the stairs. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. As he swept the flashlight around, the beam caught a glint of something metallic in the far corner. Heart pounding, he made his way over, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath his feet. What he found was a small locked chest. The lock was old and rusty, but it gave way easily under the pressure of his hands. Inside the chest were more photographs, similar to those he had found behind the mirror, along with a stack of letters. The letters were addressed to him, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. He pulled one out, his hands shaking as he unfolded it. The letter began with a chilling salutation. "Dear Dr. Collins, I have been watching you for a long time." The letter went on to describe intimate details of his life, things no one should know. It spoke of his childhood fears, his insecurities, and his professional struggles. The writer seemed to have an almost supernatural insight into his mind. The final paragraph sent a shiver down his spine. "I know your deepest fear, Dr. Collins. I know you fear losing control, losing your mind. But you have nothing to fear from me. You should fear the one who sits across from you." The realization hit him like a physical blow. John Doe wasn't the mastermind behind this torment. He was a pawn, just like Dr. Collins. The true enemy was someone else, someone who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. Determined to find out more, Dr. Collins rummaged through the chest, uncovering more letters and photographs. Each one revealed another layer of the twisted game he was caught in. The letters mentioned a figure known only as the Watcher, a shadowy presence that had been manipulating events from the start. As he pieced together the fragments of this dark puzzle, Dr. Collins felt a growing sense of dread. The Watcher had been in his life for years, pulling strings from the shadows. But why? What was the end game? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise from downstairs. The sound of shuffling footsteps, slow and deliberate. Dr. Collins froze, his heart racing. He wasn't alone in the house. He turned off the flashlight, plunging the attic into darkness. He listened intently, the sound of his own breathing deafening in the silence. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever was in the house was coming for him. Panic set in, and Dr. Collins frantically searched for a place to hide. He spotted an old wardrobe in the corner and slipped inside, closing the door just as the footsteps reached the attic stairs. Through a crack in the wardrobe door, he could see a figure ascending the stairs. It was John Doe. The patient's face was twisted into a grotesque smile, his eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. He held a knife in his hand, the blade glinting in the dim light. Dr. Collins' mind raced. How had John Doe escaped from the hospital? What did he want? The answers seemed irrelevant in the face of immediate danger. He held his breath, trying to remain as still as possible. John Doe moved through the attic, his movements slow and deliberate. He seemed to be searching for something, his eyes scanning the cluttered space. He stopped in front of the wardrobe, his head cocked to one side as if listening. Dr. Collins' heart pounded so loudly he feared John Doe would hear it. The seconds stretched into an eternity as he waited, praying that the patient would move on. But John Doe seemed to sense his presence. He took a step closer, raising the knife. Just as John Doe reached for the wardrobe door, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. The patient froze, his attention diverted. He turned and hurried back down the stairs, leaving Dr. Collins trembling in the darkness. Dr. Collins waited for what felt like hours before daring to move. He slipped out of the wardrobe and made his way cautiously down the attic stairs. The house was silent, but he could feel the oppressive weight of the watcher's presence. He knew he couldn't stay here. He had to escape, to find help. But as he reached the front door, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A photograph had been pinned to the door, a photograph of him standing in the attic taken just moments ago. The watcher was still watching, still manipulating events. Dr. Collins felt a wave of despair wash over him. There was no escape, no way out of this nightmare. He was trapped in a web of madness and deceit, and the watcher held all the strings. With a sinking heart, he realized the truth. The watcher wasn't just an outside force. It was a part of him, a manifestation of his own fears and insecurities. He had been his own worst enemy all along, driving himself to the brink of madness. As he stood there staring at the photograph, he felt a sense of resignation. There was no escaping the watcher because it was a part of him. The only way to end the nightmare was to confront his own demons, to face the darkness within. With a deep breath, Dr. Collins turned and headed back to the attic. It was time to end this, once and for all. Dr. Collins ascended the attic stairs with a newfound resolve. Each step felt heavier, burdened with the weight of impending confrontation. The air grew colder, and the oppressive silence pressed in around him. As he reached the top, he could feel the watcher's presence, a cold, unseen force watching his every move. The attic was just as he had left it, dark, cluttered, and filled with the relics of his unraveling sanity. He turned on the flashlight and swept it across the room, illuminating the corners where shadows seemed to dance. He knew he had to confront whatever had been haunting him, the manifestation of his fears, and the entity that had driven him to the brink of madness. In the far corner where he had discovered the chest, he saw something new. A mirror, tall and ancient, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. It hadn't been there before, he was certain of it. Heart pounding, he approached the mirror, the flashlight beam reflecting off the dirty glass. As he reached out to wipe away the dust, he hesitated. The mirror felt like a portal, a gateway to something dark and sinister. But he had come too far to turn back now. With a trembling hand, he wiped the surface clean, revealing his own reflection staring back at him. Except it wasn't just his reflection. Behind him he saw the shadowy figure of the Watcher, a presence that had haunted his every step. The figure was indistinct, a dark silhouette with eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. Dr. Collins felt a chill run down his spine as the Watcher's eyes locked onto his. Suddenly, the attic around him began to change. The walls seemed to pulse, and the shadows grew deeper, more menacing. He could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, as if voices were trying to reach him from another realm. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. In the mirror, the Watcher stepped closer, its form becoming more defined. Dr. Collins realized with horror that the Watcher looked just like him, a twisted and dark version of himself. The reflection smirked, a cold, mocking expression that sent shivers down his spine. "Why are you doing this?" Dr. Collins thought, his mind racing with fear and confusion. The Watcher's eyes seemed to bore into his soul, and he could feel the weight of his own fears pressing down on him. The whispers grew louder, echoing his deepest insecurities and regrets. The Watcher raised a hand, pointing directly at Dr. Collins. The message was clear. This was all his doing. The madness, the paranoia, the fear, it had all stemmed from within him. The Watcher was a manifestation of his own mind, a creation born from his darkest thoughts. Dr. Collins felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had been fighting himself all along, trapped in a cycle of self-destruction. But now, standing before the mirror, he knew he had to break free. He had to confront his fears and reclaim his sanity. Taking a deep breath, Dr. Collins stepped closer to the mirror. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the cold glass. The Watcher mimicked his movements, their fingers meeting on the surface. The connection sent a shock through his body, and he felt a surge of emotions, fear, anger, sadness, all at once. "You're not real," he whispered to himself, his voice shaky but determined. "You're just a part of me, a part I need to overcome." The Watcher's smirk faded, replaced by a look of surprise. The attic began to shift again, the shadows retreating as the whispers grew fainter. Dr. Collins could feel his strength returning, a sense of clarity washing over him. He focused on the mirror, on the reflection that had haunted him for so long. With a final burst of resolve, he smashed the mirror with his fist. The glass shattered, fragments scattering across the attic floor. The Watcher's form disintegrated, fading into the darkness. The oppressive weight lifted, and Dr. Collins felt a sense of liberation, a lightness he hadn't felt in years. The attic returned to its normal state, the shadows receding and the air growing warmer. Dr. Collins stood amidst the broken glass, breathing heavily, but feeling a profound sense of relief. He had faced his inner demons and emerged victorious. As he made his way down the attic stairs, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he still had a long road ahead, but he was no longer afraid. The Watcher was gone, and he was free to reclaim his life and his sanity. Back in his office, Dr. Collins found the courage to look at the photographs and letters one last time. They no longer held power over him. He gathered them up and burned them, watching as the flames consumed the remnants of his torment. With a sense of closure, Dr. Collins prepared to move forward. He knew that the journey to healing would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it head-on. The Watcher was a part of his past, a dark chapter that he had finally closed. As he stepped out into the sunlight, Dr. Collins felt a newfound strength. He was no longer a prisoner of his own mind. He was free,